Hello, I'm Loralie Tangen, Master Food Volunteer since 2010, and today we're making bread, and I want to give you some tips to help your bread making journey be a little bit easier and more successful. So, starting with water, we are going to be making 4 loaves of bread at one time. I am adding honey. And this is all pre-measured, so not to worry. And I use either avocado oil or olive oil in my bread. But you can use any oil that you want. And next I have pre-measured a gluten and yeast. That goes in. And now we're going to add enough flour to make a really wet dough. And I am mixing a hard red and a hard white 100% whole wheat flour today. The reason I'm mixing these two flours is because hard red has a little bit more of a nutty flavor and a little earthy flavor, and the hard white has a little softer texture. So I like to blend those. All right, let's take a look at this dough. This is a little bit more wet than I want it, so I'm going to get as much flour as I can into this mix to still have a pretty wet dough. Okay, so let's put in a little bit more. All right, that's a little bit more like what we want. It doesn't matter specifically. We just want a really wet mixture of flour and water. And one of the ways that we can help our gluten develop is to let this soak or sit for 10 to 20 minutes. So that's what we're going to do. So while this flour is absorbing the liquid, we're going to talk about a couple of other things. One is bread pans. When you're choosing a bread pan, often you will see the bread pans listed by the weight, like a 1 pound loaf or a 1.5 pound loaf or a 2 pound loaf. What I found is more helpful is to select your bread pan based on the measurements. And these are a little over 4 inches and a little over 8 inches. You'll find if your bread pan is too large, then your bread won't have that nice rounded top. It'll just be kind of flat because it's going to spread out to fill the space of the pan. So you'll quickly come to be able to match the amount of dough with the size of the pan that you have. The other thing about bread pans is whether or not they have a handle. And I really do like the handled pans. And the reason is when the bread is in the oven and it's hot and I go to reach in and take it out, there's nowhere to grab. I have found that an oven mitt with fingers is pretty helpful and I can kind of grab the end of that, but this is more of a two-handed bread pan, whereas these I can grab with one hand. The same thing happens when your bread's all proofed and ready for the oven and you go to grab it. It's hard not to put your thumb in the dough when you don't have handles on your pan. So that is what I recommend on bread pans. Another tip that I can offer is when you're proofing your bread and you have a cold house, I use a seedling heat mat, and this has just got a little bit of gentle warmth underneath it. And I put my bread pans on the seedling heat mat. It helps the bread rise gently and kind of speed up the process, especially if you have a stone countertop. Those can be really cold. So we've let this rest now for about 15 minutes, and you can see a few bubbles in there. Most of the flour has absorbed the water, so we're going to go ahead with the next step. This is the point where we are adding about a tablespoon of salt. And I'm going to add enough flour to make this dough get up to the consistency that I want. So bread making is not about a specific measurement of flour, it's about what the dough is telling you. So even though we do have guidelines on our recipes, they are starting point for your flour. So what we want to see happen as we put more flour in is that the dough is going to clean the sides of the bowl and it's going to start to come together into a ball. You can already see we're going to need at least a little bit more flour. So you can see the dough is starting to come together. It's starting to clean the sides of the bowl. And the reason I keep putting this lid on is when I first put the flour in, I started, it sends up a little poof of flour. So that's just to keep the dust from going around the kitchen. Now I can see I'm still going to want a little bit more flour, but we're getting close. If I get too much flour in, I can always add a little bit of water. Okay, so now we want to answer the question, how do I know when my dough has enough flour? And the way that I measure this is by touching the dough and see if it's sticky or not. Now this is not sticky, and I already have enough flour in here. If I stick my finger in the dough and the dough pulls away or sticks to my finger, it is a little bit too sticky, and this might even be just a little drier than I want. So I'm going to put about a tablespoon of water in there. Okay, that's a little better. So at this point, I want to show you what the dough is going to look like and how it's going to behave. And you'll notice if I grab a piece of dough, it just breaks right off. If I try to roll it into a ball and press it out, it's a little bit lumpy, but I'm not able to stretch the dough. And that means the gluten is not developed to the point where we want it for the bread. So that's why we have the kneading process now to develop that gluten. So I'm going to let the machine knead this dough for about 8 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, we've been kneading now for 8 minutes, and you can see that the dough just kind of settles and relaxes when we turn that off. We're going to do the window pane test, which is how we know whether or not our gluten has been developed enough to make a nice lofty bread. So the first thing is I'm going to grab it a little bit and see how I have to really tug it a little more. I can already tell you this is going to make a pretty good window pane because it's giving me that resistance. So after I roll it into a ball, I just start flattening it out and stretching it. The reason it's called a window pane test is that you try to stretch it thin enough that you can see light through it. All right, so this is ready. So you notice we put the flour away and we're going to be shaping these loaves. I have a little bit of palm oil shortening that I put on my hands. You can use butter, lard, anything. And the reason we don't use flour is that the dough has already got the perfect amount of flour. And one of the most common reasons for a dry brick when you're making bread is that your bread has got too much flour. If you're kneading bread by hand, there comes a point where your bread has enough flour. And if you continue to knead, it's always going to take on more flour. So what I recommend is at a certain point when you have your dough at the right consistency, you can wipe off the flour and then go to this method where you're using more of an oil. So here is this is again a 4-loaf recipe, and you'll notice it isn't sticking to my hands, it isn't sticking to the counter. I'm going to weigh out my dough. And the reason I weigh out my dough is because I want to know if I have a difference between loaves in the oven. I want to have eliminated the variability of a different amount of dough. So this is a 4-loaf recipe, and it's a 1.5 pounds. So I want 1 pound, 8 ounces. Okay, so there's our one, and I set that aside, and then I'm going to do the other 3. Every recipe, every time you make it is a little bit different because of the different humidity, different flours, the age of the flour, and so on. So I think I'm going to have a little extra. Okay, if you have a little extra dough, that could be made into a hamburger bun, a small pizza, or some rolls. So that's not a problem. Okay. So I have my portions of dough, and the first thing to remember is it's not the county fair, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm going to push this roughly into a rectangle, and I want the smoothest side on the bottom, and I will kind of smush it in a little bit, and then I get my fingers underneath and stretch it a little bit, fold it over, push with the heel of my hand. That gets out the air bubbles until I have a log. Flip it over. I'm pinching the edges together, and then I kind of roll out that, flip it long ways, and I'm going to give it just a little bit of shaping there. I will drop it down on the counter once or twice. That sets the bottom, makes the bottom a little bit more flat so it doesn't roll in the pan. It goes into the pan, onto the heat mat. Now, this isn't the only way to shape a loaf, it's just one way. Okay, now we are on the seedling heat mat. Cover this with a tea towel so it doesn't dry out, and we're going to let this rise. So I recommend that at this point you would set the timer for about 2/3 of the time you expect it to take for the bread to rise. And the reason for that is you will be wanting to preheat your oven before your bread gets to the perfect point of rise. If you don't preheat the oven early, then your bread can overproof. So in my house, this takes about 30 minutes to rise. So I would set my timer for about 20 minutes just to know to check on it. It could be more, it could be less, but that's just what usually happens in my kitchen. So I want to talk to you a little bit about mixers. And when you work with whole wheat flour, it is a little more taxing to the mixer. So if you're using especially a multiple loaf recipe, you will want a heavy duty mixer or something a little more industrial so that you don't burn out your mixer. You may have to stop in the kneading process and let the mixer cool off. But that's been my experience with mixers. As you can see, this has a really 3-pronged dough hook. This is a very sturdy dough hook, and this particular type of mixer has the motor on the bottom, and that gives it a little bit more power. Also, I like that I can cover it completely to keep the humidity in and to keep the flour from going all over the kitchen. When you have a good basic dough recipe, that dough is very versatile. It can be used to make pizza crust, cinnamon rolls, dinner rolls, hamburger buns, hot dog buns. So don't be limited to just bread. When you get that technique down, there's lots of things you can do with that good basic dough. Okay, let's take a peek. We can see the bread has risen. It is not ready to go in the oven yet, but we have just turned on the oven to preheat. We'll let it go a little longer. Okay, we're ready to check this. Let's see. What we want is the height of the dough to be about 1 inch above the edge of the pan, and I think we are about there and ready to put it in the oven. Okay, our timer has gone off. Let's take a look. Oh, this looks really good. So I always do temperature check my bread, and this is not ready. It's reading 136. I like to get it to 190 or above, and that way you'll know for sure if your bread is done or not. So it is better to set your timer a little bit short and check on the bread than to, risk having it burn. So we're gonna let this go another 5 minutes. Okay, we're gonna get the bread out of the oven, check the temperature. Let's see if I can stick it in. All right, so this is done. I like it to be at least 190, and a little higher is fine. If you find your bread collapses after you get it out of the oven, that is a sign that it usually didn't bake long enough. So we are done. We're going to take this out of the oven. Okay, I do like to check more than one loaf because depending on where it is in the oven, ovens have hot spots and cold spots. So this one is also at 206, so I think we're good. We're going to get this out of the pan. And we'll let this cool about 15 minutes before cutting into it, and we are good to go. Happy baking. So when you're letting your bread rise and you're preheating your oven, there may be an occasion where the bread gets overproofed or it has risen too long. So what do you do in that situation? You can just dump it out, reshape it, put it back in the pan, let it rise again, and it'll be great.